Today, actually, we are finishing up our vision series in which we've been dissecting our vision statement, revealing the kingdom of Jesus together in Kansas City. The first week that we started this series, Alex took some time to unpack what it means to reveal the kingdom of Jesus. Like, in order to reveal it, we have to know what the kingdom is. And so he spent some time doing that in the first week of our series. Second week, I took some time to talk about what it means to do the church together, what it means to do this whole thing here at Midtown. And then finally, today, we're looking at the last part of that statement in Kansas City. Specifically, what does it mean to be the church to the people of Kansas City? So let's dive in. In the United States, volunteerism is on the decline. My nonprofits in the room know this to be the case because it's something that's being hotly contested and talked about in nonprofit circles and has been for the last several years. According to a report released in 2023 by AmeriCorps and the U.S. Census Bureau, a smaller share of the American population is volunteering now than it did 2 decades ago, devoting fewer hours to activities. On average, Americans devote just 25 hours annually to volunteering. And this is astounding when we compare today's statistics to the statistics of 2002. In 2002, Americans on average were volunteering 52 hours a year. And unfortunately, we have let this reality infiltrate our church circles. In many churches, we have seen a decrease in volunteerism, or what we have maybe done is delegated volunteerism to particular people. Many of us have adopted a philosophy that says certain people or ministries are called to serve the poor, vulnerable, and struggling as a way of shifting our responsibility onto other people. And there are a few reasons why both Christians and non-Christians alike do this. Number one, personal responsibility. There are many who do not serve because of their belief in personal responsibility. They believe that they have worked hard for what they have and that others should too. NPR and the Kaiser Family Foundation conducted a poll in the early 2000s, and they found that approximately half of all Americans believe this. Specifically, when asked the question, which is the bigger cause of poverty today, that people are not doing enough to help themselves out of poverty, or that circumstances beyond their control cause them to be poor, 48% responded that people are not doing enough. This might be why about 2/3 of the public say there are strong conflicts between the rich and the poor. Obviously, personal responsibility and choice are significant contributors to the circumstances of anybody's life. But it is reductive to think that anyone is solely a product of their choices. When we believe personal responsibility is the only thing that matters, we can quickly dismiss those who struggle as undisciplined or lazy. And this is not the heart of Jesus, as we will see today. The second reason why people do not volunteer is passivity. Many of us have grown up with certain privileges in life that have either kept us from understanding the plight of poverty or have kept us at arm's length from those in need. Prevailing research shows that people tend to interact almost exclusively with people who share similar educational histories, incomes, and occupations. It is so easy to settle into the numbing comfort of the American life and to not pay attention to the pain and the heartache of those around us. And there is no place this is more prominent than the church. You may have heard it said that Sunday is the most segregated day of the week, and that does not just apply to race, that applies to economic status too. Thus, when we lack proximity to something, i.e., those of a different social class, we're often passive. Hence, many people's passivity towards poverty. The third reason why many people tend not to volunteer is pace. I really like my P's today. That was intentional. According to the Standard Center on Longevity, over half of Americans say the most common reason for not volunteering is lack of time. With increased financial pressures, work pressures, family pressures, many opt out because they are working longer hours or feel like they mentally and physically cannot do one more thing. The pace of life just feels so overwhelming that the last thing on the to-do list is serving. I have a whole lot of compassion and understanding for some of these reasons. But I think Jesus followers' lack of service, of caring for our hurting neighbor, is a problem because, as we will see today, Jesus' teachings are pretty clear. Relationship with and service to those on the margins is a gospel mandate. And Jesus demonstrates what this looks like when we read Matthew chapter 1, starting in verse 12. So if you would turn there in your Bible, or if you want to follow along on our gathering guide today, just hit today's liturgy, scroll down, and you'll see the sermon notes. A brief history on the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew is one of 4 gospels, and it was likely written by Matthew, who was a tax collector and disciple to Jesus. Throughout the book of Matthew, we see the author trying to show us how Jesus is the continuation and fulfillment of the whole biblical story, of God's story, of Israel's story. And we'll see that actually in our passage today. Prior, though, to verse 21, Jesus has actually entered Jerusalem on a donkey. This is what we call the triumphal entry or Palm Sunday today. And this is significant because Jesus is not just simply entering a town and gets some recognition. Jesus is purposely declaring his royal authority and intentionally provoking the Jewish leaders and the elite. And the events of the triumphal entry or Palm Sunday and the events that we just read about are the reasons why Jesus is led to both arrest and death. So let's read it once more, picking up in verse 12. Matthew writes this. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it into a den of robbers." And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did and the children out in the temple crying, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant. And they said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read? Out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise." Mic drop. And he leaves them. I just love that last line. He leaves them, goes out of the city, goes to Bethany, and lodges there. Jesus, filled with passion for the house of God, breaks all the social norms to confront injustice at the temple. And then he enacts justice in 2 ways. But before I get to those 2 ways, I actually want to talk a little bit about biblical justice. Modern Christianity has a tendency to divorce or separate personal righteousness or devotion to God from acts of outward justice. But interestingly enough, the biblical text does not do this. In the Hebrew, the word for personal righteousness is tzedakah. Any guesses on what it is for justice? Tzedakah. They're the same. Okay. This means that when we read the scriptures, the term justice and the term righteousness are interchangeable. When we see righteousness, we can replace it with justice. And when we see justice, we can replace it with righteousness. Furthermore, according to rabbis, tzedakah could be defined as 3 core practices. And these 3 core practices were prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. And this isn't just something random that a few rabbis came up with. This is actually something that Jesus himself teaches on. This is what Matthew chapter 6 is based on in the Sermon on the Mount as Jesus instructs people to do these 3 things. So, the three core practices: prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Prayer and fasting are what we would consider more private forms of righteousness, things that we tend to do on our own. Whereas almsgiving is a more public or outward form of righteousness. We might call this social justice today. Almsgiving doesn't just mean giving money, but it also means giving of your time, your energy, your service, your rights, and your privilege. And this matters because it means the biblical narrative never divorces our devotion to God from our action towards neighbor. It never says righteousness is one thing, justice is another. Rather, they go hand in hand. This means prayer can be a radical act of justice as we talk to God about what we are working on together. This means fasting can be a powerful act of solidarity as we experience the pain of food insecurity and hunger. This means that almsgiving, service to the hurting, can be an act of devotion and righteousness, that in serving, we declare our love for God and praise to Him. In the words of Pastor Tyler Staton, the Hebrew understanding of devotion to God or righteousness is to care for the poor. And to care for the poor is to be righteous or right with God. And we know this to be the case, not just because the Old Testament says so, because Jesus says so too. In the Old Testament, there are over 200 distinct biblical references instructing us on how to care for the poor. That works out to roughly 1 out of every 10 verses. And in true Jesus fashion, he takes the Old Testament and he furthers it. In Luke's gospel alone, Jesus references taking care of the poor 1 out of every 6 verses. I don't know if you've read Luke recently, but it's a long gospel. In Matthew chapter 25, Jesus says God is not just with the poor, something that was taught over and over again in the Old Testament. No, Jesus says God is in the poor. He says how we treat the poor is how we treat God. Jesus, in fact, is accosted throughout the Gospels by other Jewish leaders for eating with tax collectors, sinners, the unclean, those with physical disabilities, the poor, those of lower social class, women, children, and those from the wrong side of town. And in doing so, he reinforces and extends that Old Testament teaching we were just talking about. Relationship with and service to those on the margins is not an optional expression of Christianity, but an inseparable part of what it means to follow Jesus. I think American journalist and social activist Dorothy Day sums this up well. When asked, how do you live the gospel? She responded by saying, stay close to the poor. The problem we see in both the temple of the first century and the church today is this. You cannot divorce private forms of righteousness from outward social justice. You cannot devote yourself to Jesus through prayer and fasting and also disregard those on the margins. You cannot live the gospel and ignore the poor. And this is what Jesus demonstrates time and time again and in our story today. He calls out the injustice that had invaded the temple, and he enacts justice in 2 ways. Number 1, through what I'm going to call a holy tantrum, and number 2, through relationship. So let's begin by looking at Jesus's holy tantrum. Now, notice I didn't just call this a tantrum. I called it a holy tantrum, and that's intentional. Verses 12 through 13 have often been used by many to justify violence, and I want to be very clear that is not a good application of this text. Notice Jesus does not kill the money changers. He does not injure the money changers. Rather, we learn in the other 3 gospels, he simply drives them out. Additionally, Jesus' anger here is one reserved solely for the Jewish leaders and elite of that day, i.e., those who should have known better. those with privilege who had used their privilege for their own gain and not in the service of other people. And so it's with that understanding of Jesus's holy tantrum, you may ask, well, why? Why does Jesus do this? And there are a few reasons for this. Number one, Jesus was almost certainly provoking Jewish leadership, knowing that these acts would lead to his necessary, required sacrifice and death. Number two, Jesus was likely dissatisfied by the commerce happening on the sacred ground of the outer court. And then the third reason, the reason that I want to focus on today is this. Jesus was likely angered by the temple's segregation and exclusion of certain people, the wrong people. In the temple of Jesus's day, there were four courts: the court of the Gentiles, so non-Israelites or foreigners; the court of women; there was also the court of Israel, or really Israel men; and then the court of priests. The Jewish elite had divided these people into four courts for the sake of what they called purity, as they believed both women and Gentiles were unclean. They took purity so seriously, in fact, that the inner temple courts were enclosed by a balustrade with posted notices in both Greek and Latin, warning foreigners and uncircumcised persons that crossing into one of the other courtyards was punishable by death. And this reality brightly made Jesus very angry. This is likely why he quotes Isaiah 56 verse 7 and Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 11 when he says this: "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it into a den of robbers." See, those in Jesus's time, his audience would have known the full context of both of these passages by heart. They would have known Isaiah 56 and Jeremiah 7 promise God's acceptance of the foreigners and the eunuchs as members of his people. Both passages declare that God's temple will welcome all peoples and that this reality has been God's desire all along. Not only were Gentiles and women segregated in the temple courts, but children and the blind and the lame were excluded. They were not permitted entry. This is why Jesus welcomes those with disabilities and dignifies the children's song. And so Jesus throws a holy tantrum in response to both the segregation and exclusion he sees in the temple courts. He flips over tables. He drives out the money changers and merchants with a whip made of cords. He dumps their bags of coins onto the street. He drives out the animals and says, "My house, my temple, my church will be a place devoted to God." And that means this house will not just be devoted to prayer, private righteousness, but those on the margins, outward social justice. The new world order is being welcomed in. And this is reinforced when the temple curtains are torn in half upon Jesus's death. Gone are the days of segregation and exclusion. Welcome to a new era of belonging. And this is not just important because Jesus is on the side of the marginalized. This is important because in this story, we see Jesus correct systems and structures that marginalize people in the first place. Cue Jesus's holy tantrum. The second way we see Jesus enact justice is through relationship. In verse 14, we see the blind and the lame come to Jesus and he, keywords, heals them. And this is extremely significant because of a story we find actually in 2 Samuel 5, verses 6 through 10, and 1 Chronicles 11, verses 4 through 6. So I'm going to do a little story time today. So it's story time with Cassie. So buckle in, make sure you're comfy, okay? Sitting crisscross applesauce? No. Okay. Here we go. Here's the story. Once upon a time, there was a king named David. who wanted to give his country a new lease on life. He decided hostile takeover. That's the best strategy. And so he sets his sights upon a city and says, that city, I will make it my capital. There was a problem, though. The city was well protected. It sat up on a high rocky crag, and it made it all the more desirable for David, but also all the more difficult for him to conquer. As you can imagine, though, the inhabitants of the city weren't too keen on David's idea, but they also weren't super worried. They thought that David would have a lot of trouble trying to defeat their city king and armies. In fact, they were so confident, they sent a message to him saying, we've given all of our guards the day off and put the blind and the lame in charge to keep watch and send messages. And this, as you can imagine, infuriated David as he felt mocked and ridiculed by these people. So he devised a plan. Wahaha, evil plan at work here. He discovered where the city accessed their water, and he followed the water shaft up to the city. And as a result, his armies defeated the city, and he made that city his capital. Despite this victory, David did not forget the scorn of the local people. For this city is the city we know today as Jerusalem, the place of the temple. And because they're mocking, David said, no blind and lame welcome here. You're not included in my temple. No reminders of the mocking enemy that ridiculed me. Even though David is described as a man after God's own heart, he also messed up a lot. If you know the story of David, you know this, and this is actually one of those times. David bars the very people for whom Jesus will call blessed and says, you are not welcome here. And as awful as this story may sound to our ears today, I think the church people have committed David's very sin. We no longer welcome the blind and the lame into our temple. We have stopped welcoming them into our churches. We have stopped welcoming them into our homes. We've become far too homogeneous, far too comfortable, and far too similar. But notice what Jesus does. For the first time in thousands of years, Jesus welcomes the blind and the lame into the temple, into his house. And he doesn't just send out invitations. He heals them. He meets them where they're at. He draws close. He gets intimate. He dignifies them by saying, you are now a part of the house of God and the family of God. Welcome. Remember, Jesus was consistently disparaged, not for serving the marginalized, but for eating with them, for reclining at table with them, for loving them, for moving into their neighborhood. Author and activist Parker Palmer writes this: we cannot do good by standing back and pulling levers that drop bounty on people who need it. Right action can only be an immersion that involves us in a relationship. Or as Brian Stevenson writes in his book, Just Mercy, you can't understand most of the important things from a distance. You have to get close. Here is my vision for you, church, that through serving the city, you would discover family, that you would enter into rich and deep relationships with those that look different from you, that you would have dinner with individuals across social class lines with those that live across town from you. That you would advocate not just for a cause, but for a friend, because that cause now has a name and a face. That cause is no longer just a number. That you would live the gospel by being close to the poor, oppressed, and marginalized. Pastor Tyler Staton puts it this way: it's not enough to serve the poor. Jesus does not call us to charity. He calls us to family. I can guarantee you this will not be easy. In fact, it will be very, very hard. For true justice cannot happen from a safe distance. It's costly, it's inconvenient, and when you start, it will feel awkward and uncomfortable. But I can also guarantee that if you opt out, you will be missing out on a part of Jesus. There is a part of Jesus you will never know. For Jesus says, you will find me on the margins. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I was in need of clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Relationship with and service to those on the margins is a gospel mandate. And today, we have a very practical way of practicing that gospel message. In the past, we have had monthly serve days here at Midtown, and these were phenomenal, absolutely fabulous. And we'll do a couple of those throughout the year still. But there were some downsides to the way in which we did this model of ministry. The first one is this. Serve days may not have been accessible to everyone because of work schedules, family commitments, location, age of your kids. You fill in the blank. The second would be it's much harder to establish relationships with people you might see every few months. And thus, we are moving to a new model of serving our city, our community, Kansas City. And so here would be my ask. If you do not regularly serve with a nonprofit in the KC Metro, or if you do not work in the nonprofit sector, reveal the kingdom in Jesus in Kansas City by volunteering with one of our partners here today. You can do so by using that QR code on the back of your seat. And then you can also talk to one of our amazing partners after service. Speak to each of them, please, and prayerfully consider to committing to their organization regularly. And as you do this, I want to offer a few pieces of advice for integrating this practice into your normal life rhythms. First one, make a realistic commitment, not an idealistic one. You may get really excited because of the sermon or not. I don't know, maybe I did a bad job. And then you're going to think, I'm going to serve multiple times a week. But let's be honest, for most of us, that's not realistic, right? Choose to make a realistic commitment to those represented today. Second, prepare for the awkward. Just prepare for it. You will be learning the realities of a new community, and sometimes, if not always, awkwardness will happen. Accept it, be okay with it, move on. Number 3, communicate. Communicate, 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 communicate. If you say you are going to do something, do it. And if you cannot, if an emergency comes up, pick your phone up and give them a call. Send a text. Do not ghost someone. Regularly show up. Be faithful to your commitment and communicate when you cannot. Number 4, ask questions. Remember, Jesus has called us to relationship, not charity. Ask a lot of questions. Fun fact, that's how you make friends. So if you've been struggling to figure out how to do that, ask questions. Ask a lot of them. It's how we enter into true relationship with others. And here's the fun part. You may discover in your service that those you're around have much more to teach you than you have to teach them. Number 5, make the goal family. This is not just about showing up once a month, checking a box, and wiping our hands clean. This is about integrating people into our lives. This is about creating a family, opening our homes, schedules, lives, and rhythms and families to other people and saying, there is always a seat at my table. There is always room in my microchurch. There's always a seat after church for lunch. Kansas City does not need a church with all the right political persuasions, posts, and stances. Kansas City needs a new kind of family. A community where friendships don't make sense, a community that ignores unspoken codes of conduct, and a community that crosses invisible dividing lines. Worship team, if you would join me. I want to end today with a story, and it's a story that's really special to my heart. And so if I tear up a little bit as I'm telling it, you'll know why. 3 years ago, on a Sunday much like today, there was a man named Will who crashed into Alex and I's life. We first met Will actually on the steps of this very building. It was particularly chilly that morning, and I could tell that he was really needing a warm place to sit and something warm to drink. And so we invited him in before service. We got him settled. We got him a nice warm cup of coffee. If you knew Will, you know he loved coffee with a passion that I've never seen before. And we didn't know it at the time, but Will would become part of Alex and I's family. He not only faithfully joined this community, but he joined Alex and I's life. In fact, I'm actually not sure we had a choice in the matter. Will kind of claimed us. He invaded our neighborhood. It was no secret that Will lived a really hard life. When we met him, he was houseless and he had recently suffered a series of strokes that had left him with a stutter. It made him hard for him to talk, and he had some other health issues that made it really difficult for him to work. So you might expect Will to be a really hard, really bitter, really mad person, but wouldn't you know it? 90% of the time, he was the happiest person alive. His smile was so contagious. His gratitude towards this community was boundless. His love for God was astounding. And the way that he loved other people, oh Maria. This community helped Will find a house, a job, friends, a family. This community invited Will to their Christmas Eves, their Thanksgivings. This community embraced Will with a love he had never experienced before. And this community was embraced with a love we had never experienced before. And then this community buried Will in July of last year. Alex and I were actually the first to hear of it because we were Will's emergency contact. We were his family at the hospital. And I will never forget Alex's words at Will's funeral. He said this: "We want to be the kind of church that becomes your family when you have none, that loves you, yes, to the end, even to death, that buries you when no one else will." Will was not simply a problem to be solved or a person to be served. Will was family, and we miss him. When we allow God to take us to places we don't want to go and to people we wouldn't likely meet, he creates the possibility for unexpected friendships that become like family. And I think everyone in this room needs a Will in their life. Let's pray.